just a bit of introduction on primate conservation. Primates are declining globally, and more than 85 of the described species have declining demographic trends. And this is mostly because of anthropogenic pressures. As we can see on the map, primates occur in close to the tropics. And these are also areas with immense population growth. And this brings a lot of challenges, right? Not only are habitats being destructed on these areas, but also this destruction as well, coupled with the population growth itself, is increasing the overlap between the primates and the humans, and also increases the accessibility of humans to areas that were not accessible before. And this can be a problem, right? Because humans and wildlife, they share their landscape, so they share resources, and they share, and this can lead to some conflict, potential conflict. Sometimes it doesn't bring any conflict, but sometimes it does. And this is why, and to aim conservation, we can look into biological aspects of the system, so zoology, ecology, genetics, and genomics, but looking at the social part of the system, so how humans interact with these species, their perceptions, their attitudes, but also the needs and expectations from conservation is also very important, and it's due to this potential interspecies conflict. So let's assume that we just look at biological reasons and biological ways to help the system, and we put a conservation program. And here is our focus taxa, right? After we implement the conservation program and it's successful, we hope that the population size will increase, but also if there is conflict, and this conflict can be on many different levels, but if there's an underlying conflict will probably increase as well as the number of animals increase, for example, the primates. This can lead to increase in invasion of farms and crop raiding and so on. And if we get to this threshold, there's this unknown threshold for tolerance of the local population, what can happen is that it can bring the failure of the conservation program, and this is, of course, being very simplistic. There's other reasons why conservation program would fail. But one of the issues of ignoring the human perspective is also that sometimes we don't even know if there's conflict, if there's a lot of conflict or little conflict. So we don't. Sometimes we could even not see this threshold being reached. And so this is where understanding the perception and attitudes can help us. So they can help us, first of all, identify if there's indeed chance for conflict between humans and these species. And also, if we pay attention to the needs and expectations of local populations, we can try and maintain the conflict, the tolerance threshold. So we can try and keep on the local population that inhabits and shares these landscapes with these species happy, basically. And this can ensure the adherence of the local populations to the conservation programs. And so we can, basically the conservation program can thrive. Of course, this, again, as I said, is very simplistic and there's a lot of variables into this. So I'm going to introduce to you the, I'm sorry, I left the water there. Oh, sorry. Introduce to you the case study. So the work we did was on the Bijagó Archipelago. This is off the coast of Guinea-Bissau, a West African country. And this place is recognized by its immense biodiversity. But this biodiversity is usually, when they refer to this, they are often referring to the marine and to the intertidal biodiversity. Because the terrestrial biodiversity remains still kind of poorly studied, the primates included. And on this location, we can find, in this archipelago, we can find 3 primate species. They do not overlap except for one of the islands. So it's like 80 islands, and they only overlap in one of them. And this can have consequences later for a later part of the work that I'm going to show you. So the three species are the green monkey, the spot-nosed monkey, and the Campbell's monkey. These are all guenons. Guenons are known to be the most genetically diverse primates in Africa. And they are also known to be, well, most of the species are known to be quite flexible as well. And these primates don't, because of their wide range and this flexibility, they're not necessarily on any conservation concern. As you can see, least concern and the spot-nosed and Campbell monkeys are near threatened. Most of the presentation is actually going to be about the spot-nosed monkey, because the spot-nosed monkey is near threatened globally, but in Guinea-Bissau, the populations in mainland are thought to have been extirpated in the last 30 years. There's no records of them. They don't appear on the surveys anymore, but they still exist on the islands, and we know that we do know. But on these islands, there's not really any formal protection of the species. They are locally threatened by habitat loss and degradation, particularly for the plantation of cash crops, so crops that bring money to the local populations in a relatively fast and not very a fast way. And they are, as we described before, what we described in 2023, they are being subjected to commercial hunting. So we knew that subsistence hunting happened on these populations, but because the demand in Guinea-Bissau, mainland Guinea-Bissau, is quite high of primate bushmeat or wild meat, we found that they are shipping some monkeys into the mainland. And by doing some interviews, we realized that they are perceived as decreasing. So local human populations say that the monkeys are disappearing and becoming rarer. So are there any other issues that we can think about that could affect these populations? And yes, we can think about insularity. So insularity, just by itself, can bring some changes. We know it brings some changes to the genetic background of populations. After the islands are colonized, the gene flow with the mainland usually disappears or is very, very low. Because these colonizations tend to be done by just a handful of individuals, they usually have a severe population bottleneck signals, so a severe decrease in their genetic diversity. And not only that, but because of their isolation, they are more prone to loss of diversity throughout time because of increased genetic drift. And of course, increased inbreeding, because we are, as I mentioned, just the colonization is done by a handful of individuals, so they are bound to have reproduction between conspecifics. Okay, and so this was more general, so that was more like general reduction in genetic diversity, more neutral, I guess. What happens when we look into variation on protein coding genes? So we have the gradual loss of diversity, but we also know that when we have that genetic drift and inbreeding, promotes the conversion of non-deleterious mutations that were present on the heterozygous state into their homozygous state. And so when they are present on the homozygous state, they are expressed. And when they're expressed, there's a decrease in individual fitness. And if this is widespread across the population, we would see a decrease in the population fitness. And when we get to this point, the literature shows us that small populations that have increased realized load tend to go two paths, right? Because they have a decrease in fitness. So we can have increased genetic purging, in which these individuals, these mutations are not passed through the next generation, and they are removed from the genome of the individuals, the next generation of individuals. Or we can have the opposite, which is an accumulation, continual accumulation of these deleterious mutations, and this can start an extinction vortex. And how can we see this? One of the ways is looking at, for example, in genetic purging, which is the most common effect that we have been seeing, like in kakapoos and other insular species. We can see that there is a lower number of the total, decrease in the total number of mutations, but also a decrease in the total number of alleles. And this I will explain a little bit more when we get there, right? So island populations, they are more threatened because of inbreeding and genetic drift, but also there's a good thing about them, is that often islands are known to be hotspots of evolution, right? And because of different selective pressures between mainland and island. So there is a lot of interest in preserving insular populations. Okay, and just because I insisted on talking about the human dimensions, just a bit on the background of the local populations of the Bijagó Archipelago. Most of these populations are from the Bijagó ethnic group. There is a lot of social cultural variation within the archipelago, just from language to traditional practice. And there is this generalized thought that since they are animistic, their ways of living and their traditions passively contribute to a sustainable use of their ecosystems. And just some background on their colonization. It is thought to have occurred around the 11th century when there was massive shifts in massive migrations of humans in West Africa due to the expansion of the Mali Empire. Okay, so this project was mostly to get baseline information that could inform conservation. So on the biological part, we looked into population structure, colonization history of the primates, and the genomic effects of insularity. And on the social part, we looked at the attitudes and perceptions of people. How do they see the monkeys? Are the monkeys good for them? Are the monkeys bad for them? And the dynamics of social cultural adherence, because remember, it is thought that they contribute passively to the conservation of ecosystems, but this can only happen if they still adhere to the social cultural ways, right? To so for the first part on some population structure, there we go. Of the spot-nosed monkey. This was done with non-invasively, and we got 11 microsatellite loci for 67 individuals. And we used this data set to estimate genetic diversity within the archipelago, population structure, and the colonization history. So genetic diversity was intermediate when compared to other primates, the genetic diversity in other primates using the same set of microsatellite loci, which is not to be unexpected. I mean, guenons are indeed very diverse species, but it's heterogeneous across the archipelago. And this could be for many different reasons. Could be the carrying capacity of the islands, because some islands are bigger than others. Could be due to the colonization history itself. If it's sequential colonization, we'll tend to have lower diversity in islands that are furthest away from the continental part. But when we looked at population structure, we found that there were the most likely number of genetic clusters, and this is open to discussion, but how to interpret them. But we found 5 of them. So basically each island, the populations were very structured. There was some hierarchical structure, which is not shown here, in which different islands split at different levels of K. And again, this is not that unexpected. These primates are arboreal. Most likely they don't just swim across these islands, right? So there is a lot of population differentiation. But when we look at the pairwise FSTs, there's some funny things. Because if we imagine a stepwise colonization pattern, which is sometimes, it's often the most common, we would expect to see that islands that are closer together would have lower pairwise FSTs, and this is not exactly the case. We can see here the island there's a lot of links to, so those arrows represent the the highest and the lowest pair for all of the islands. And we can see that the lowest pair is always with Kenyabac Island. So does this have a pointing? Yeah, this one, right? And this is still the case for example, these two islands. So the pairwise FST between this one and this one is lower than between these two. This is, yeah, so it seems that we did other tests for this, but it seems that population differentiation is not compatible with a sequential colonization. So what happened to these monkeys? How did they get there? So that's the next step to estimate the colonization history. For this, we use both MSVAR and ABC modeling to test for some demographic scenarios. The first question was, do we detect signals of population decline? So which are typical of island populations. And that's just a depiction of the ABC models that we use. So for those that don't know, ABC modeling is basically we simulate a lot of data sets with following different demographic scenarios, and then we see which of these scenarios most well explains the observed summary statistics of our data sets. And also, what is the most likely colonization scenario? Do we have vicariance? Because that's another important thing about the archipelago, which could potentially explain why we don't see the stepwise pattern. This is not an oceanic archipelago. So this archipelago was formed when the rising sea levels flooded the continental plate. So it is possible that differentiation is just stochastic, because you cannot really control which way genetic drift goes, and the population got isolated and they just diverged. So the vicariance model, an ancient colonization. So even though this is an alluvial archipelago, the archipelago formed and then the monkeys arrived there, and we'd see some Asian pattern, but also recent colonization event, and perhaps human mediated. And why human mediated? Guenons. This group of primates can be found across several Atlantic archipelagos, and the justification for their occurrence is usually because they were very prized by European societies back in the 15th, 18th century. So not only were they prized as items, they were also used as food for the enslaved trade, as live food. So perhaps there was some human influence to these guenons as well. There is no really historical records that suggest so, but potentially. Okay, so now into the results of this part. So in A, we have the plots for the MSVAR. And so if it's on the first one, if the log of the N0, N1, so ancestral population size and current effect population size is below 0, it suggests population contraction. If it's above 0, it suggests a population expansion. And there is some degree of uncertainty for some of the populations, but usually we see yellow stripe. There is a generalized pattern for population bottleneck. Using the ABC approach, so on the little boxes between the two models, we have the base factors and the posterior probabilities. So the model on the bottleneck model always had very high base factor compared to the null model and much bigger posterior probability. So yeah, generally speaking, we do see a bottleneck signal on these populations. Yeah, and the overall changes in effective population size could be up to 2 orders of magnitude. When we tested the other results, though, the other scenarios, so the more complex scenarios, we found that 2 of them had very high support. And these were the vicariance model. So sea level rose, isolated the islands, population started differentiating, but also The recent founding event was also was supported across all populations. Yeah, I don't specify there, but yeah, it's for all of the tested populations. So what happened? Was it human mediated? Was it a normal isolation event? We cannot really say for sure, but one of the hypotheses could be that there was an initial population that got isolated, but then they could have spread to the rest of the and there's the estimated time by the ABC. So after around 12,000 years ago, they got isolated, a reduction in population size, and then after the arrival of humans, so up to 500 years ago, there were some potential movements between of these populations between the islands. And again, we know that they are boreal, so most likely there was there could have been human hand behind it. And yeah, because this was a very important place for the trade at that time. So now, we know that generally speaking, we see insular patterns typical of insular populations. We see a reduction in effective population size, a reduction in overall genetic diversity. So it then becomes, there we go. Then it becomes important to look into what are the effects of these contractions, of these insularity, on these species. In here, of course, the most important species for conservation is the spot-nosed monkey, but we have a big issue with the spot-nosed monkey, right? To do a comparative study between what happens in mainland versus islands, which is we cannot really find them on mainland. So for that, we had to use some previously published genome of a West African of another spot-nosed monkey elsewhere from West Africa. But then the question is, how can we know that that pattern is reliable, considering that this can come from a population that has diverged, we don't know how many thousands of years ago. So this is why we thought, let's look at the other species as well, because insularity being that strong as we think it was, probably, and if it occurred on similar ways between all of the different species, we could probably find some commonalities between these. So for that, we used the Campbell's monkey and the green monkey, which are much more common in mainland. Of course, there's still some quite big disparities between sample size, but for those that work with primates and for those not, we kind of know that it's very hard to get these samples because these are opportunistic. These are from wild meat markets. So yeah, we sequenced these samples. Yeah, the 30x short Illumina reads. We mapped all of these samples to the rhesus macaque, which is the best annotated genome closest to the three species as a whole. There's a very good one for the green monkey, but we thought that could potentially bias the results when doing a 3-species comparison. So we got 48 genomes, mapping coverage above 20x, and 50 million SNPs as a whole. More than that. That's the green monkey. Yeah, so what is happening to genome-wide diversity and inbreeding? Just for reference, usually on all of these plots, mainland is represented as brown in color, and always on the right of the right side of the graphs. If we look at genome-wide diversity and inbreeding, we use basically two metrics. One of them is the proportion of the genome under rows of homozygosity, which we know that arises from conspecifics mating, right? So as we can see, for the 3 species, so regardless of species, the island populations have a much higher proportion of their genome under rows of homozygosity. So we have a clear pattern that is common amongst the 3 species, which is exactly what we're looking for. We did not expand on species specific because, again, Our objective is to look at the three of them, explore commonalities. When we look at the genome-wide diversity, we again see a similar pattern between the three species, whereas mainland populations have much higher genome-wide heterozygosity than insular populations. Yeah, so again, starting to look good in the sense that perhaps this approach, this three species approach, can actually inform us about something on the spot-nose monkey. So then we looked at long-term effective population size. And again, regardless of the method we use, in this case, we can see the results from beta PSMC. And on the other plot, we can see the results from BPP analysis, which is also a modeling approach, but it's more used for speciation. And that can, yeah, if we can discuss it later as well. But yeah, so regardless of the species, we see that island populations have had a lower long-term effective population size than the mainland counterparts, and it's the same on the BPP analysis. So the mainland, which are the brown ones, have much higher effective population size than the insular populations. So okay, again, it seems that what we find we are finding using these genomes what we'd expect for insular populations, if lower effective population sizes, lower diversity, probably due to this bottleneck event that took part during the colonization of these islands. But again, this is the same slide as before. What about what is happening at the protein coding genes? What about mutational load? And again, as realized genetic load, so genetic load that is not expressed, is converted masked mutational load is converted to realized mutational load, which is expressed. We would expect these two patterns, so increased genetic purging or an extinction vortex happening. So we looked at that. For this, we annotated, we used the VP annotation pipeline to annotate the derived alleles according to their predicted deleteriousness. And I'll zoom in later, but just as an overall look, we can see again, mainland is always on the right side. There is a general pattern of conversion. So here on the homozygosity plots, we see a reduction, an increase in insular populations compared to the mainland across the three species. So another generalized pattern, probably resulting from the commonalities of insularity. And here, I'm sorry, the plots are a bit, yeah. Anyway, another interesting thing is that we see this reduction regardless of the type of the deleterious mutation. So loss of function, deleterious missense, tolerated missense, and synonymous, they all show the same pattern. And this is something that hints us at genetic drift. So the number of allele, the homozygosity is just increasing across all of them because of genetic drift, and selection doesn't seem to be mediating these changes. Otherwise, you'd see differences between the synonymous and the non-synonymous. So we have an increase in homozygosity, right? So which one of them is it? Is it genetic purging? Is it an extinction vortex? Okay, so we went to look into, remember, diagnostic features, so purging, lower number of mutations, and lower number of derived alleles. And when we looked at these, we found that the relative abundance of the alleles is the same between insular populations and mainland populations. And this is not to be expected, right? Populations usually go either way. So what can actually be happening behind these? Sorry. So what we think is that since genetic drift is so strong, what's actually happening is that almost the accumulation of homozygous alleles, so they are becoming homozygous anyway, right? And we saw that on this graph. is being compensated by the random fixation of non-deleterious alleles. So that's why the relative abundance of alleles remains the same, because genetic drift is just either going one way or the other randomly and at the same rate. Oh, there we go. And why is this? We don't necessarily have an answer yet to why this is happening. As I said before, literature typically shows the two patterns. Something that has been mentioned that could potentially explain is that these species are genetically diverse by themselves, so they are quite diverse. And perhaps this extinction vortex or this increased purging only happens if populations were already had lower levels of genetic diversity, such as the Kakadu when it colonized some of the other islands in New Zealand. But also, guenons are quite flexible. And for us to see a pattern of genetic purging, populations need to go through a reduction in fitness. And for those individuals that have a lower fitness to be left out, and for these harmful mutations to be purged away. So maybe because they are that flexible, they somehow manage to cope with the loss of genetic diversity, because ecologically they just can. And we do know that not only on this system, but on the other island systems, guenons are doing very well. Their populations have basically exploded since they colonized those places. So yeah, could be that, could be species specific. Yeah, I'll love to explore this and understand if this is a more common pattern than previously thought. So now, I talked about the human dimensions, right? And why is it important already? Because conservation cannot really sustain itself long-term without taking special care of how people see conservation, how people see the animal, right? So part of my work was also to look at the local perceptions for these and basically focusing on perception attitudes towards the primates, but other species as a comparison. And to understand if social cultural adherence is changing, in the sense that if it's changing, maybe that passive conservation that they have on their social cultural repertoire is going away, is disappearing because people don't care about it anymore. So we did some questionnaires balanced by location, gender, and age. This is this is not probabilistic, but is so because there's no census in the area, so we don't really know what's the proportions of each of the proportions of the people and their traits. And so our objective was to establish sociological scale. For those that are not familiar with the term, it's basically a sociological scale is basically just grading the animals that are present on a certain place according to whether they are beneficial or not to the local people that share their landscapes with. And this is basically things that what we did was basically you put a lot of photos on, and you ask people to identify species according to dichotomous traits, so good and bad, and and then you give a score according to whether they were called first or second or the third. So imagine someone says that a chicken is good, that would get a score of 3, and then if after that they say the cow and the sheep, the cow would get a 2 and the sheep would get a 1. And other traits that we looked into were the perception of the beauty of the animal, the perception of whether the animal was very common or uncommon, and this is again, this is perceptions, right? Because sometimes animals might not be very common, but if they are always on your face, you'll perceive it as common. Okay, yeah. So and we went to 3 islands, and why these 3 specific islands? It's because these islands have different. So they can be classified in a gradient of social cultural adherence in theory, right? So we have 2 very traditional islands where there is they still do many of their cultural practices, and then we have Boubac, which is the capital of the archipelago, where you have a lot of tourism, where you have a lot of different churches and things like that, because it was very important. They had a very strong presence also of the Portuguese during the colonial, the time that they were controlled by the Portuguese. And also, there's some differences between the traditional islands where we have, so in Urok, we have a local ONG that is doing some biodiversity management actions, and also actions to preserve biocultural diversity. But in Kenyabac Island, that is not the case. So yeah, there is no active biodiversity management, and this can affect, of course, the way people see the animals and conservation. There's the questionnaires. Okay, so what did we learn about the sociological scale? Okay, so just to explain the graph, on the y-axis we have the average likability score, so whether a species was considered good or bad. And then on the x-axis we have the frequency. So how many times, what's the frequency of that people selected those species, right? So basically here, the domestic animals are great. They are great. They have high likability scores, particularly the chicken, and they are mentioned very, very frequently. So basically, as you can see here, almost everyone mentioned the chicken as being good, at least one time. And then on the wild animals, we can see that the guenons are not doing particularly well in terms of how people perceive them. They are quite mentioned. So they are definitely a part of the daily lives of these local populations. And they are relatively considered bad. People don't necessarily like them. And this could be because crop raiding. We are talking about local populations that are still whose livelihoods depend on agricultural, are mostly on agriculture. So you can imagine that if a guenon is very good at raiding and suddenly eats off of your crops, you won't really like that. And guenons are known to be particularly good at raiding. So yeah, they're down there. Most wild species are relatively not that well perceived, except perhaps the gazelles and the duikers, where people they don't mention them very frequently because they prefer to mention the domestic animals, but they do think that they are generally good for them. And reasons for this: they are considered beautiful, or they are considered edible. They are quite liked, as well as. So we then took this and, okay, let's look into, is there any pattern between what kinds of people consider the guenons bad or not, and what kind of traits are associated with the notion of bad? And this is where we explored this questionnaire data using multivariate analysis. And this is for the guenons in specific. And what we can see here, first of all, is that there is variation. There is a, well, I'm going to start for the traits then. There is a high utilitarian value. So they are quite edible. People consider them to be quite edible. Again, not really unexpected. There is not a lot of big mammals at these islands. So they are indeed a very, very important food item. And so, yeah, and at the same time, we saw this people generally that thought that they were edible or they were bad also said that they wanted to see them more frequently. And this can sound a little bit strange, but maybe not, because they are very edible. So why wouldn't you like to see your most important food item more frequently, right? But there's also differences between how men and women perceive the species, right? We see that men consider them very unintelligent, while women consider them very intelligent. And this can be, in this case, men mostly said that they were not intelligent because you would set up the crop protections, and they would still rob your crops. And that's an intelligent because they are not following your order, the order that you decided for nature, right? But in the case of the woman, they think they are very intelligent because it's more or less the same reason. They say, oh, they're very intelligent because they can steal anyway. So maybe there's a difference between what man would like monkeys to do and women. And this is very important for conservation because conservation can impact people differently according to their own specific traits. Also, we saw differences within the archipelago, which are this like Rock Island, Bubak, and Canhabac. But we do think that this could be species specific because remember, they do not overlap. So perhaps there are some species that are worse for cooperating than others, particularly here in Urok, where people said that they were very bad. So there was a very strong association. This is the green monkey, which is the more terrestrial of them. And typically terrestrial primates are known to be better at cooperating, or at least, yeah, the arboreals still do it, but they're usually more afraid to go to the ground. Okay, so again, what is this really telling us? It's telling us that a conservation program at the Bijagó Archipelago, first of all, we would have to look into differences between islands. So it's not going to be the same project for every island. Probably it's not going to be met equally by the local populations, but also the different whether we approach the way we approach man and woman is probably going to have to be different, right? This is just for like conservation actions that are focused on the guenons. But if you remember the previous graph, is it really good to target the guenons for conservation policy? I would argue that it's not. It's not going to be a good idea, I don't think, due to how frequently people say they are bad or they are the worst animal that they have close to their homes. So what about, oh, well, there was supposed to be a square there, but maybe what we can do is potentially conserve other species. For example, the gazelles. People thought that the gazelles were quite good for them. Or as we saw on the monkeys, the monkeys had a very high utilitarian value, for which in this case is not necessarily positive for conservation because it's associated with food, is associated with exploitation. But perhaps if we change this association, if we try and change it, for example, to get I don't know, like revenues coming in, as people associating revenues with wildlife, this could change. And they could still see the monkeys as positive in that regard. But yeah, perhaps I would say that perhaps focusing on other species that are not that damaging could passively help the guenons. And just to finalize, we were talking a little bit about their passive way of contributing to nature conservation. And this is only possible if people still want to follow their social traditional system. And so we did some questions. This was just yes and no. And the questions were, are your traditions important to you as an individual? Do you think that, what's your perception? Is it decreasing? And do you want your children to follow the same social cultural traditions? So yeah, most of the people we interviewed said that they were very important for them individually. Most of them said that yes, they think it's decreasing. So it's decreasing, and typically what was reported is that younger generations do not want to go through some of the practices that are required for them. And when you ask, do you want your children to follow your traditions? There is a significant percentage already of people that say they don't want to. And this is because there is this association between, or dichotomy between going to school and going to the tradition and staying on the traditional system. And so there is a very strong will of people that their children would go to school, and that makes, in their own personal view, makes it difficult to counterbalance that with staying on the social cultural traditional system. Okay. Oh, this is a bit off. So putting all of this together, implications for conservation of these studies. So guenons, all the guenons, spot nose is definitely the one that is in a more dire situation in Guinea-Bissau. They have the typical signatures of island populations, so decreased genetic diversity, increase in breeding, and decrease in effective population size, which suggests to us that long-term maintenance of genetic diversity can be compromised in the future, right? But at the moment, we don't see any immediate risk by accumulation of deleterious mutations. So they seem to be doing okay with the current levels of inbreeding. So what could we suggest? Potentially address the immediate threats, address the excessive hunting, the commercial hunting, because we don't know how increasing extraction will interact with the deleteriousness that already exists there on their genomes. Could lead to and another big issue at the Bijagó Archipelago is not necessarily a conservation issue, it's about food security. What can we do in a region where people really depend on the monkeys to eat? This is one of the, this probably needs to be addressed before, or at the same time as we address the biological aspect of the guenons. And potentially explore some alternative utilitarian role for the guenons so that people associate them positively as they kind of do in terms of food, but to change the food aspect of it. So potentially, because people are bringing money to see the guenons, that could be something that an alternative utilitarian role for these guenons. And yeah, I think that concludes it. This is, you have my email there if you have questions after this, of course, and this is the team and everyone that supervised me during this during the execution of this whole research project. Thank you.